passing third and heading towards home. And we saved one of the very best for last, a closing dialogue on strategic reflections moderated by Dr. Ike Wilson, president of the Joint Special Operations University. And I'll have to add, this is a live panel. It's a recap, and it wouldn't be a recap if our panelists didn't have access to all of the things that we've shared with you over the last 2 days. So it is literally happening as we speak. And Ike will be joined by my boss, the Honorable Mike McConnell, former Director of National Intelligence, Director of the National Security Agency, and currently Executive Director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. Ike and Mike will be joined by Frank Cilluffo, Director of Auburn University's McCrary Institute, and Michael Allen, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies. You've heard from both Frank and Mike already, so we look forward to this closing panel. Ike, over to you.
Thank you, Ron. And again, I'm Dr. Ike Wilson, and I'd like to first welcome the virtual audience to what is our final session of this 2-day Great Power Competition Series conference, focusing on 2 decades after 9/11, the attack and the U.S. military diplomatic response. Our session today, this afternoon, is titled Strategic Reflections, a Closing Dialogue. Now, before we get started, just a few quick but important updates. First, as you know, and probably as you can see on the screens before you here, this panel was going to include CENTCOM Commander Frank McKenzie and SOCOM Commander Richard Clark. However, at the risk of stating the obvious, they are both still very involved in current operations, and as a result, they will not be able to join us today. Also, panelist Michael Allen, that you see in the agenda that you received, was called away at the very last minute, so he will not be joining us today either. Thankfully, our own here from the Joint Special Operations University, our own Dr. Joe Long, has graciously agreed to stand in for Michael. Thank you, Joe. In addition to Joe, our group includes former Director of National Intelligence in the NSA, the Honorable Mike McConnell, and former National Security Council staffer and Homeland Security Advisor, Auburn University's Frank Cilluffo. Sorry, Frank. Second, this discussion is live, folks, and not pre-recorded. We're doing it in real time, and in part because we simply wanted to be able to observe and reflect on the conference in its entirety and offer thoughts that are as up to the minute as we can make them. So with that, please bear with us and be patient with any technical glitches. And lastly, although Ron and the agenda have identified me as the moderator of this panel, or of a panel itself, my fellow panelists and I are going to try to take a little different approach. We're gonna improv off of the jazz bass line, if you will. I'd like to reframe this as more of a roundtable discussion around our topic of 9/11, reflecting on what we've learned, maybe learned over the last 20 years, as well as over the last 30 or so days, particularly in reflections on the epilogue, that is prologue, that is the military withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, I'm a longtime big believer in what I'll call the 3 R's when it comes to strategic reflections of any sort, and what we might more appropriately call or consider strategic net estimates. The imperatives of first and foremost are number 1, remembering, and this is what this conference is all about, this back to our futures. Remembering first and foremost, essential to what probably is the most important thing, a reckoning with what we did, a reckoning with the say-do gaps. All that essential towards what is the ultimate aim, frankly, of any type of strategic reflection and estimate, towards some type of future forward reconciliation, right? Again, of those say-do gaps. All this, those 3 R's I might put on the table, essential to arriving at true lessons learned. Short of that, I believe we're talking about at most lessons gathered, but not yet learned. And hopefully we'll be talking around that, or maybe directly at that paradox over the next 60 or 70 minutes or so. To facilitate that 3 R's approach, my panelists and I are initially going to look back at some highlights of this conference. After that, we'll discuss and reflect more strategically at some of the enduring themes highlighted by our speakers, and then we'll project forward. We're going to foresight forward and talk about where we think we are heading as a military, as a diplomatic corps, as a development community, et cetera, and as a country. And with this group, I'm sure we'll cover some very, very interesting and provocative ground. We're going to try to, we have two rounds of questions and back and forth. We'll see how far we get, but we promise you it'll be rich and a fun afternoon. So let's get started, beginning with a question I have for Mike McConnell. So Mike McConnell, let me ask you about our leadoff segment with Michael Morell. You and he spent a lot of time in the intelligence community. So what did you think of his remarks, and especially his insights on the role of Intel on 9/11?
Thank you, Ike. Before I answer your question, I just want to take a moment to thank two people who are responsible for most of the heavy lifting to put this conference together. Dr. Ron Sanders, who's our staff director in Cyber Florida, and also Kate Whitaker, who is our communications director. They just did incredible work, and the support contractor to put it all together. Lots of others did things. Thank you to those two, but those two have been working night and day to pull this off. So I acknowledge that and thank them very much. To answer your question about Mike Morell, one of my heroes, he is a great American, and I found his remarks absolutely riveting. I think the fact he was with the president and then recounted the events of that day and then flying back into Washington, I got to tell you, when he recounted that story of Air Force One coming into Andrews with F-16s on each wing, whose mission was to put themselves between a missile and the Air Force One if it was fired, that gives me cold chills just to think about it.
Absolutely.
So as an intelligence professional, we're supposed to be apolitical. So I was a little bit surprised and pleased that Michael Morell's comments addressed some of the political issues. I think it was very important, gave us a historical perspective. And I think I'd have three comments. And I'll mention these now, maybe we'll come back to them later. The intelligence community operates on the basis of need to know. That was developed in World War II. It served us well in the Cold War, but we're in a new era. And so for a while, we were playing with not only need to know to protect sources and methods, we entertained the idea of need to share. And that got some popularity. I think we need to go further. In the intelligence community, we should adopt an ethos of responsibility to inform. If we've got information that's going to help someone or protect the country or protect a force or whatever, the intel world needs to find out how to get it delivered directly to them. Now, I want to comment a little bit about what Mike Morell said about the future. What's going to be our action with regard to Afghanistan in the future? You've heard the president say we will act from over the horizon. You cannot act from over the horizon without actionable intelligence, actionable specific intelligence. So that's the first thing we have to achieve. Second thing is we're going to have a military capability to use that intelligence. You got to have ability to reach over the horizon. The first will be challenging. The second, I think we pretty well got sorted out, but the long range issue is going to be political will. What is going to be the political will of the country to back this kind of continuing activity? Now, I want to say one other thing has sort of become a stump speech for me, and it's about the community. Large organizations, my observation, and I've looked at lots of them, will choose failure over change. And what do I mean by that? Bureaucracies are built for continuity, resilience, not innovation. And so there's just a situation where if you're large and established with positions and organizations and rank and so on within an organization, you're not looking to change it. You're mostly focused on preserving it. Now, we have a need to share information. 9/11 Commission identified that. We passed legislation, Intelligence Reform Terrorist Prevention Act 2004, charged the president with creating a culture of information sharing. The president handed that off to the new office of the Director of National Intelligence. I had the privilege of serving as the number 2 DNI. There are 3 magic words in the federal government: direction, control, and authority. If you have direction and control and authority, you can require an organization to behave in a specific manner. the DNI has direction, control, and authority over one thing, his personal staff. Every other intelligence organization is overseen with direction, control, and authority by the department secretary. CIA is a little bit different, but it says CIA will report through the DNI to the president. Good lawyers can drive a truck through the word through. I learned that quite a bit. So let me stop there and go to my good friend, Frank Cilluffo, who has been a real champion in supporting us at Cyber Florida and the many, many panels and so on. So Frank, we're indebted. The question I have for you is, you interviewed H.R. McMaster, General H.R. McMaster. He didn't pull any punches. So I'd like to get your views on what stood out about General McMaster's comments.
Well, thank you, Admiral. And before I jump into that, I want to thank you and congratulate you, Ron, Kate, and the whole team for putting together yet another phenomenal conference. And I love your 3 R's, and I wish we had answers to all of those, but I think we need to continue to strive toward that. And Admiral, at the expense of adding one more to your big 3, I would add resources to that. So you can have direction, you can have authority, accountability, but policy without resources can sometimes be rhetoric. So I love your 3, but I would just add the resource element to that. So let me jump right to HR General McMaster's comments. He certainly didn't mince his words. And you can see why perhaps he didn't always align 100% with his political masters, because he speaks it as he sees it. And I find that refreshing, and I find that rare. And whereas I may not agree with everything he said, the truth is he articulated very forcefully what I think many of us have been thinking this entire time. And I'll give a different twist. I'll throw Mark Twain in there. And to paraphrase him, whereas history may not repeat itself, it does tend to rhyme. And the reality is, even people who are hard of hearing like me, it's pretty hard not to hear that rhyming going on right now. It's pretty loud. And I think he did identify a handful of issues that I really should be front of mind of our policymakers and our national security establishment going forward. In his words, he referred to it as, which I found most powerful, is that the U.S., quote, surrender has given the Taliban the ability to shape the future, the authorship of the future, I think was his terminology. That's pretty stark. That's pretty sobering. And I think it's pretty, unfortunately, spot on. I think first and foremost, we've got issues of our credibility with our partners, with our allies. Who else is going to want to work with us if they're put in harm's way and they're doing difficult work, if they don't have guarantee we're with them over the long haul? I think just as importantly, it emboldens our adversaries, and not only in Afghanistan, but it also signals to others in Africa and elsewhere, at least from the global jihadist perspective, that game on. And I think that some of the signaling there is going to be exploited by our adversaries. I think most importantly, and this is where I may take a different position than some of my panelists here, I don't know, I am very concerned about some of the potential shortcomings in the over-the-horizon counterterrorism approach going forward. I mean, at the end of the day, Admiral, you nailed it. You need good intelligence. The truth is all the technical means in the world is not going to provide the same sorts of insights that good old human intelligence that you can only get from boots on the ground will provide. And I am worried that we are not necessarily going to be blind, but we're not going to have the full context to be able to put, as the Brits call, MI5 calls, the rich picture around all of these issues. So I am genuinely concerned about where we are in terms of our counterterrorism posture right now. I think that first and foremost, it's regional. Also, some of our allies in Europe are probably definitely paying a lot closer attention right now to the environment, but you can't rule out the homeland. And quite honestly, that is the genesis of all of this. Was obviously the ability to maneuver and provide safe haven for those who wish us harm. And when you're looking over your shoulder, you have less time to plot and execute attacks. So I hope that we are able to keep our political will, because I think you're spot on. That is first and foremost in everything here. But in addition to that, we need to ensure that we have some of the capabilities that I think some of our hard-earned gains may be waning. So all things said and done, he was very stark. He was very strong, and dare I say, don't shoot the messenger. He had some important things to say.
Frank, could I just jump in with a follow-up?
You bet.
Comment? Just to offer a point of view, and I think Michael Morrell made the same point. There's no doubt in this former military professional's mind that Al-Qaeda and ISIS will reconstitute. And they have a long-term mission. They're committed. This is a mission of faith. It's not a mission of being paid to do some job. And I think they will not only reconstitute, but they will look for ways to attack the U.S. homeland.
I hate to say I agree 100% with that assessment. So thank you, Admiral. I'm going to jump.
Frank, can I jump in again too?
Oh, please.
As promised.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's roll.
We're going to improv a little bit.
I'm an Auburn guy. I'm not allowed to say let's roll. So
well,
sorry. Go ahead.
you had invited us. You had invited us with your thoughts on being maybe presenting something a little different than the rest of your panelists. I'm certainly not speaking for the command, but from a soft enterprise standpoint, in relation to the over-the-horizon CT approach, and as the academic, right, as the university president, I will say this: disclaimers abound here. I'm only speaking for us from an academic freedom kind of approach. Not impossible, certainly, it's not impossible, but it is undeniably more difficult. To both of your points, Frank and the Vice Admiral. What is something that we have to be serious about considering and analyzing? Again, I'll tell you from the university perspective, is one of the takeaways, I think, from the last 20 years, the great takeaways, that regardless of whether we're in a so-called GWAT environment or era and rebalancing to a so-called strategic competition or GPC era, I would put on the table that one of the major takeaways is that should not be lost is the critical capability that we developed through the School of Hard Knocks and Blood and Treasure expenditure over the last 20 years of this combination of, and I'll focus on, given my bias, I'll focus on SOF, but the Special Operations Force married with and combined with exquisite intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and I would put at the heart of that human connection, that human presence, in support of, with precision targeting in support of an indigenous partner, an indigenous ground force. Frank, I think your concern is really important for many reasons, not the least of which we may already be feeling, if not seeing, the pulling apart of that system of system, right? When we go to these, when you start pulling out critical elements of that combination, we may unintendedly untether a systems capacity, not just a capability, but a capacity that transcends whether you're in a GWAT, so-called GWAT context or a so-called GPC context. I'll pause there, see if anybody has any comments.
Hey, I got to jump in because I think that's really well said, and quite honestly, great power competition that's here. GWAT
Yes.
ain't over. They aren't mutually exclusive.
Yes.
The reality is the bad guys have a vote in all this, and I think to your point, it's getting everything synced up. And quite honestly, your community deserves a huge debt of gratitude for getting all of that synced up over these years. Quite honestly, I think shoulder to burden that is beyond what any single combatant command can, but did so successfully. So the real issue is how do we ensure that we don't lose all the lessons and the scar tissue, and dare I say, the lives of so many young women and men who've that everything. So I share that. All that said and done, China is here. that is a reality, but we're going to have to be able to deal with a multifaceted environment, and if the U.S. wants to lead, it needs to lead out of a position of authority and credibility, and dare I say, hopefully, lead. So I just wanted to jump in because I share that 100%.
Very well said.
If we got a minute, I'd like to add something there, and kind of building on what Ike was just saying too. We have to recognize that in this, the power of connection is larger than it ever has been. So, when we put on our historian hats, we look backwards. We're not really looking backwards at tales of connection. When we look forwards, that's going to have to paint our pathway forward. So I think connection and recognizing that we have to get down to the human essence of the problems is something we have to make sure as we're trying to, gather lessons. That's something that we really have to capture in this process.
Well said.
Joe,
I don't like agreeing with everyone. I don't like agreeing with everyone.
I know we're already
we're
agreeing way too much right now, right? Joe, I think your last point is, I think Frank, you're going to dish the next question over to Joe, and I think Joe's last point is a perfect segue, literally to ground level.
Yeah, you couldn't have teed it up any better. So I wanted to draw on some of your interview with Master Sergeant Scott Neal, which was awesome, by the way. So great stuff. And want to sort of get your thoughts on what resonated most deeply with you. And he really did point out the lack of cultural understanding playing a significant role in the attacks and their aftermath. And not to go to the future, but what can we do to avoid repeating those mistakes over and over and over?
Well,
over
thanks,
to you,
Frank. Yeah, I couldn't ask for a better question, and I'm really, really excited that you asked that, because that's really the essence of what the interview was all about, and the reason why I was excited to do it, because we have a chance to look at what's happening right now, or what just happened in Afghanistan, and then compare it to 20 years ago with one of the first people on the ground, and then think about what connects these two events. And like Ike was saying before, this is a chance for us to gather these lessons and actually try to digest them and learn and try to activate them. So I think you could tell in that I was very interested in trying to help us collectively, as a special operator and as a scholar and as a lifelong defense professional as well, to help us figure out how we can learn from this invasion all the way through the withdrawal. So one of the things that I've come up with and that keeps going through my mind is this inherent need that we might need to activate our ability to learn the right lessons. And to do that, I think sometimes we need to start at the beginning and start thinking about the phrase nobody likes to talk about sometimes is brand strategy. We have to have a collective way, in a long-term and enduring way, that we can see how we interact with the world. And I'm gonna try to help us shape that whenever I get a chance to speak in these things, because I think that this is an important part of it. So without a really long, enduring strategic lens, I think that we find ourselves very easily able to go back and forth, to be reactive to party lines. And it makes us forget that we need to consider the role that it plays in the world, talking about connection. We need to think about the role that the US plays in the world and how that role can be enduring. So I tend to look at everything, some people are political scientists, some people are historians. As a leadership scholar, my default lens is to look at problems as leadership problems. And in doing so, I sometimes think that we forget that we're not trying to control the world in the sense of being an empire, but maybe we should kind of wrap our minds around the idea that we're trying to lead the world. We're trying to provide that leadership. So when we have a bad actor, maybe one of the things we can do if there's truly a bad actor is get out of that bad actor's way and let them be the bad actor instead of trying to take over that role for them. And if the principles that we say we stand for, if they're as universal and beneficial as we like to argue that they are, then they can do the work for us where less force is needed. And through a leadership lens, we get reminded that, well, it reminds me of the thing that I think is most central to leadership, and see if anybody here disagrees. But if you think of yourself as a leader, then you're inherently responsible for everything that the people you're trying to lead does or fail to do, the organization, whether it does or fails to do. And I think that's a tremendous master frame that we can use to help us navigate global partnerships, connection, how we see our alliances, and even how we measure our success. And even when we're talking about power earlier, how we can consolidate power as leaders. And I truly believe that until we figure that out, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to build a stable strategic platform that's going to be both enduring and globally beneficial. And to be honest, my guess is that our primary strategic competitor out there is outthinking us on that point, because it's an obvious vulnerability, and it's frankly one that we like to ignore. And before we get too far down the lines in some strategic lenses, I wanted to take a time while I'm talking to frame a question for my boss. So Ike.
Hey, Joe, I'm gonna
go ahead. Yeah.
Joe, I'm gonna inject on you again. I'll take your question in a minute. In fact, I'm probably buying my time to gather my thoughts. I'd love to get Mike's and Frank's, give them an opportunity to maybe react to what you put on the table. Go ahead, Vice Admiral.
I'd like to weigh in. I want to reinforce Dr. Long's point about the need for long-term strategy. If you think about it, my good friend Frank Cilluffo served on something recently called a cyberspace solarium report. Where did the word solarium come from? Eisenhower, looking at the future Cold War. And so he put a panel together, and what came out of that was U.S. long-term strategy for the whole Cold War, deter and contain. And what resulted was a bipartisan consensus that we would pay the funding, we would create the capabilities, and we had the support of the American people. So I could not agree more with Dr. Long's comment. One of the things that we really need currently is a long-term strategy. It's a vision for the American people to look out over the future. The one organization that has a long-term strategy, in my view, is China. If you want to know what their strategy is, just read their 5-year plan or listen to President Xi's speeches. They have a long-term strategy, and we need to develop the same kind of long-term view of the world with a strategy, and we need to have bipartisan support of that. We need to have the support of the American people to carry out that strategy.
I can't say it any better than Admiral McConnell did, other than 2 quick points that I think are worth looking at here. I've been a little critical over the years that we have a lot of tactics masquerading as strategy. So we fall in love, and before we went on live, and at 3 minutes before we all were on this, we've got strategy up here, we've got TTPs down here. There's something in between that isn't necessarily translating the strategic approaches with the very pointy end of the spear. And that is something I think, both from a doctrinal perspective and from a policy strategy perspective, we've really got to get our arms around. But I want to touch on a point that Joe brought up that I think is he said it sort of just in passing, but I think it's worth, do we want to lead? I clearly feel the United States should be leading at the global stage, but you almost get a sense that people are pushing back on some of that thinking, and maybe that is worthy of a question. And maybe to Admiral McConnell's point, we've got to spend a whole lot of time making sure that the American people, the populace, are on board with some of this. So it's not just the sausage making process that you don't see it all the time. Maybe there's a need to pull them into the boardrooms early. And by that, I mean, I feel we should. I grew up feeling we have to. I'm almost now questioning. I grew up realizing that democracy will always overtake autocracy. I'm not so sure that's a given It's certainly not a given if we don't invest in it. And I'd be curious what the rest of you all think on that particular issue. So I may be making a mole out of a mountain hill, but I said it backwards. But you get what I mean. I feel that is a question we've got to grapple with, and it's not one we will have the answers to on this panel alone. But it does impact and affect how we get to our ultimate end state.
Frank,
I think my view.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, my view, democracy is really hard. If you look at the history of the world, it was always autocratic. So where you start out as a fascist or communist with your point of view, you devolve to autocracy. Democracy is hard. Now, I happened to drink the Kool-Aid when I was a youngster. I listened to lots of speeches. I was reinforced. I was committed to it. So I believe in democracy and human rights and those sorts of things. I think I agree with Frank. The United States should lead. This is hard, but I was very proud when President Ronald Reagan said, "America's the shining beacon on the hill." And I really believe that. And I think it's our responsibility as a nation to step up and help the rest of the world go down a similar path.
Well said.
Mike, I'm gonna inject. I'm gonna be intentionally provocative here. I got a couple of reactions. First and foremost, I think all of us share the same guilt of buying into the Kool-Aid, buying into the narrative and the belief wholeheartedly, or else we wouldn't be on this panel together and had the careers and are still having the careers that we're having. So we're all patriots in that respect. I was going to riff off of your last point, Mike, but my own riff made me lose the point I wanted to riff off of. But it was the last thing you just said. If you could maybe repeat it for me.
President Reagan.
President Ronald Reagan. Yes, yes,
beacon
sir.
on the light, beacon of light on the hill.
Absolutely. I want to riff on that, and I agree with you. Highly inspiring. Goes back to our ancient Roman and Greek traditions, the Western civilizational underpinnings. But a beacon of light is inviting because of the manner in which it shines. It's different if you're pressing that light too harshly, perhaps, relatively speaking, on other. If the light is a beacon of hope, how much do you have to find yourself as a nation pressing it forward? I would add that as a context to the question, as part of that remembrance and reconciliation for the reckoning that I talked about, that second critical R, because this ties to the second point I wanted to make to Frank's original point. Lead, yes, but in what manner? In what manner of leadership? And does the United States, is the American way of leading, has it become, over perhaps specifically over the last 20 years, overly reified to a very particular understanding of what leading is? A leading from the front, with a very particular type of traditional military kinetic force as the front edge, maybe the front, middle, and last. So the manner of leadership, I think, is particularly important as well. And then the third piece would be, I can't help but do this. I'm an old American politics professor. I'm reminded of again, I'm all in on the American democracy thing, small d. But I'm also reminded of the healthy skepticism and the worries and flat out concerns and fears that our own founders and framing fathers, and there were mothers in there as well, that they had particularly with pure democracies and even republics, representative type democracies, and how fragile they knew they were, both to external threats, monsters seeking them out to destroy, and take advantage of their openness and in their ecumenical nature, but also at the same time, very, very ripe and suspect to challenges from within. We certainly understand this when we think about nationhoods and statehoods that we've, but I think sometimes we perhaps maybe don't recognize and reckon with our own fragility, which comes on the back end of our greatest strength, our openness, our polyglot, heterogeneous, diverse civil society. Frank, your life being all things cyber, you live this every minute of every moment of the enemies the challengers at the gates and inside the gates, physically and digitally and virtually. But I'm just reminded of all those things. Perhaps we're holding on too tight to a very particular form of leading. And I'm reflected back on, I think, what we should all take pride in President Reagan's notion of, being that shining beacon on the hill, and allowing the light to be the lead of us in and of itself. Follow our ideals and inspire true small s self-determination towards small d democratization, which may not necessarily need to equate to an Americanization. I know that's a provocative thought to put out there, but this is Strategic Reflections at the end of 2 days conference, and we promise to be a little provocative. So
Right.
I'll pause there, see if anybody have any reactions.
Yeah, I wanted to add just a little clarity. So what I was saying about let the benefits of this do the work. If America is this shining city on a hill, we don't have to tell everybody that. It will become obvious because they'll be looking up at it. And going back to also our strategic discussion, if we don't have any long-term strategy, then we don't have any way to really reinforce what we have. And then we're going to find ourselves again, more so, with tactics masquerading as strategy. We're going to go back to maybe over celebrating rhetoric that we have, or misuse of military operations so that we can gain some sort of tactical feel like we're achieving some sort of strategic end, instead of doing the work that we really need to do, which is, if we're going to lead, let's be out front and let's be out there showing the rest of the world with transparency what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong and addressing those issues. Because it's going to be hard for anybody to buy into what we're, I don't want to say selling, but essentially that's what it is. We're making an argument that we figured out a way that's special to manage human beings on this planet, and we want to share it with you. And that can get confused with tough guy rhetoric, with tactics over strategy. And those are some things that maybe we have an opportunity to tease out in this forum and other things that we do.
My view is history becomes very important here, knowledge and history. Let's start with the founders. When we were established, it was landowners, no women, with regard to who had decision rights. Now we have progressed over time. The good news is that we have progressed. There's still a lot of issues that we need to address in the current time frame, but Europe largely followed our example. Now, let me jump forward to knowledge and awareness. Afghanistan has been invaded repeatedly. It's never been defeated. The Greeks, Alexander the Great, did that a long time ago. Didn't last. The Brits were there for 100 years. And when they finally tried to divide Pakistan from Afghanistan, they drew a line, the Durand line. They drew it right through the middle of the Pashto tribal group. And I remember when I was asked to be the DNI, and I'm coming back in and trying to get up to speed, I read an interview by a tribal leader in the north. We were aligned with the Northern Alliance. And the tribal leader's point of view is, we don't want a central government. If we have a central government, they'll build roads into our village. And the reason they want to do that is to collect our taxes. So understanding where you're operating and what's the level of education, awareness, religious conviction, whatever it might be, of the population you're engaging with, is absolutely essential to get your strategy right. So I go back to my original statement. Democracy is hard, but it's still the best form of government. As Churchill said, democracy is terrible except for everything else we've tried. And I believe that. So how do we lead to get people to understand that with higher levels of education? Now, we're going to have to overcome sort of local, tribal, religious points of view to be able to cause organizations or countries to change their perspective. But I think that's an important role for this country over time. So I go back to my statement. From my point of view, America should lead in the world, and we need a long-range strategy to do that. And we ought to invest the intellectual capital and time to have to try to emerge with a bipartisan consensus on our role in the world.
Absolutely. Real quick, I just wanted to say, going back to the interview with Scott, that's essentially what I was trying to get at, is the power of an American being able to lead at that micro level, the most micro level you can probably find on the planet, or at least equivalent to it. And that's something we need to think about. Going back to when you're asking that question, sir, really, we need to be able to lead at multiple different levels, strategically, operationally, lead as human beings in a lot of ways, especially when we're, speaking from a special operator's perspective at the micro level, building those human relationships and building that connectedness, like Ike was saying earlier.
Joe,
Anyone else?
For me, it's your thesis. It's your thesis work, Joe. As SOF's ethicist, it's relational leadership. And two points just to reinforce everyone's comments. I was most taken by Master Sergeant Neal's couple of comments he made, and this is a quote: "Losing the art of the human connection."
Absolutely.
Losing the art of the human connection. I think that. That just put me back in my chair when he said that, Joe, during your interview. And then tied to that, and this is not a quote, it's a paraphrase, our tendency to build things that mirror ourselves.
Absolutely.
Build things that mirror ourselves. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about share our thoughts on lessons learned, maybe lessons gathered, not yet learned on nation building. But it's perhaps a big difference between nation building and state building. And Joe, you and Master Sergeant talked about this as well in the context of statehood in an American recognition, a U.S. or broader Western traditions recognition of different types of statehoods other than the Westphalian nation state model, and recognizing different public administration systems, trying to inform them, trying to be a good partner and try to share the like you said, Joe, the special unique attributes, some might even call it the special providence that's inherent in our particular forms of, but also having an empathetic leadership recognition, that relational leadership of, hey, these folks have their own traditions. They don't necessarily want to be Americanized. That does not necessarily mean they don't want the benefits and the bounties of small d democratization. If we equate small d democracy and democracy promotion with self-determination, right, and all the things that come with that, a belief in an undercarriage of system of minority that's based on majority rights, but a healthy, hearty, consistent, and transparent respect and voice to minority rights. Those kind of foundational underpinnings. I think that's the leadership, the leading from the front through ideas and through relational leadership is. I think that was the big takeaway for me, Joe, from yours in the Horse Soldiers conversation. And like one last point, like the Vice Admiral's comments on the thing that really grabbed him during the Michael Morrell conversation, when Mike Morrell was talking about being in the plane. Being able to bring us back to that moment. Joe, you and Master Sergeant Neal yesterday, being able to bring us back, you can almost feel the horse prints underneath us. They brought us in you guys brought us in the saddle, right? And brought us back to a very critical point, back to one of those points of foundational remembrance that I was talking about up front. I'll pause there, and I think I'm next on the hook here.
I'm ready for that. And I do appreciate the idea of being able to feel those horse hooves, because it comes on with the backdrop of what's happening right now. And it says, hey, we started out in one area and we're in another. And with the leadership thing, we know leadership's hard. If it weren't, we wouldn't have so much dedicated to it. We spend all of our time talking about leadership. General Petraeus this morning was talking about how important leadership is when we're talking about Americans. But, then when we started talking about our partners, then it was trained, advised, assist in the company. And I was like, well, hey, doesn't everybody deserve leadership? Leadership's hard. Leadership without connection is almost impossible. And, you have to understand people. So if I buy the ugly sweater thing, if I buy you an ugly sweater, I spend $100 on it, but what I gave you was something that has no use to you whatsoever. And we're going to be looking at each other completely different on this relationship. So those are some of the things that we're going to have to recognize that we're not as good at as we think. Leadership's hard, and then put the same work into building those kind of relationships as we do when we deal with ourselves. And maybe moving forward here with the question I want to ask you, maybe you can build on that. So what are your thoughts on the experiences of our two, or some of our two most influential speakers, which is former CI Director and CENTCOM Commander Dave Petraeus, as well as Ambassador Ryan Crocker?
Yeah, thanks for that, Joe. And so well said leading into it. I took some notes on both of these gentlemen. I had the pleasure and the honor of serving with both of them, particularly with General Petraeus on a couple of occasions. I was his chief of plans during his time as a two-star when he was commanding the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault during the first 15 months of OIF-1 back in 2003-04. And had opportunities to work with him over the years. Have a great respect for both gentlemen, as I know we all do. Just speaking quickly to what one of my main takeaways from both of them were, when you look at their, and again, I'm saying this and at the same time looking at Vice Admiral Mike McConnell, same category here. You're looking at folks with a full life dedicated to public service, 40 plus years of public service, all the way up through all the ranks and at every level of senior advisory, diplomatic, diplomacy and commandership. But with both Ambassador Crocker and General Director Petraeus, when you look back through their eyes and through their experience over the last 20 years, and both of them had the opportunity by great facilitation, they were able to lay out, humble as they both are, they were able to lay out their experiences, and they really both presented in their own ways kind of a there and back again reflection. One of the things that was most stark coming from Admiral Crocker was his experience. He reflected back on his time in Lebanon in the whole Beirut bombing and the Beirut crisis from the 80s. And he talked about that and he described he brought us back to that moment, though some of us old enough to have remembered and been a part of that. And then he shifts forward to his experiences getting off the plane first time when he took over the ambassadorship in Iraq. And you can almost feel the Baghdad heat hit you in the face as he was describing it. And the first thing was, I felt quickly that I was right back in the similar circumstance that I was in Beirut. It really, and that was kind of a harmonizing theme across both of their offerings, which raised the foundational question with me of, there and back again, back to our futures, round and round and again we go. Lessons gathered, yes, but then again, maybe not. I mean, how many times, first time shame on me, second time, or first time shame on you, second time shame on me. I don't know, 20 years of second, third, fourth times. Where does that leave us? A couple of pointed things that they said that I would just want to put on the table here. Maybe we can all react to them. Focusing on Ambassador Crocker, he focused, of course, on 9/11. He called 9/11 a hinge event, right? Mm-hmm. He said Afghanistan is another, and he had a lot. As you can imagine, most of his comments were on Afghanistan, and like H.R. McMaster, he held no punches. He said Afghanistan is another hinge event, the strategic inflection point, but he put the heavy caveat of our own making. Right? I'm conveying what he put on the table. Whether or not we agree or disagree is almost irrelevant. But Afghanistan is another hinge event of our own making. He called it an American retreat, literally under fire, mitigated to some degree by intense diplomatic engagement by the Department of State since. He shared some concerns, specifically what comes out of the precipitous military withdrawal from Afghanistan, reinforcing this sense now to some degree, according to the ambassador, maybe validated in terms of quote unquote, the ability to outlast the Americans, right? Beirut back then, as he reflected, Afghanistan now, Iraq next, right? We're within the 18-month window of the 20-year anniversary of where we are with the war in Iraq and the wars in Iraq, right? He went on to say we defeated ourselves, giving the Taliban a fantastic narrative of victory against the undefeatable United States and the West more broadly. I mean, it's some pretty sobering thoughts. And then he expanded and he went into this more grand strategic consequences of, to Frank's point, you know, of the tactical action, the tactical imperatives of withdraw now militarily, but what consequences upscale and what gets lost in that between the say-do gap of intention, action, and in that bureaucratic middle. Again, Joe, you in the Mash Sergeant talked about something getting disconnected in the middle, right? In policy language, it's that formulation and legitimization stage of the public policymaking process. Well, it's not only formulation and legitimization of your strategy to action. That's where things oftentimes get disconnected, unraveled, and also delegitimized. I think Ambassador Crocker really spoke a lot to that. His concerns with Pakistan, right, in the wake of, now has a much bigger radical insurgent problem. Always had it, but now it's got to confront it. Imran Khan's got to confront the Quetta Shura Pakistani Taliban directly now, right? Unavoidable. And what might that mean? That could lead to a Pakistan failed state with loose nukes, right? That's a concern, obviously. He reminded us of where we were 20 years ago with Iran in the immediate wake of 9/11. He reminded us that they were more than willing, allegedly, to work with us. I think it was more than allegedly. He was there in the immediate wake of 9/11 attacks based on a common enemy. Since that time, though, over the last 20 years, Iran certainly took advantage of the muddling through, trying to get a strategy right, while we're also having to act and take actions. He left a chilling thought, a chilling reality, I think, and none could say it better with better experience than Ambassador Crocker. There's not enough room in the region for an Islamic emirate, in his opinion, and an Islamic republic, right? Particularly when one is Sunni and one is Shia, and the rivalries that are further unleashed and that ensue. Shifting to General Petraeus real quickly, he began, I mean, it was just interesting. 8 of his last 11 years in uniform were spent involved in directly on the ground, leading, commanding, leading not only the doing, but the thinking and the rethinking, rediscovery of population-centric counterinsurgency after we had thrown it into the dustbin of our own history by our own hand coming out of the Vietnam experience. I'll get to a wonderful comparison that Michael Hanlon facilitated him into in terms of comparing the Vietnam experience with the Afghanistan experience. And I'll get to that in a moment, but just a couple of points before that. General Petraeus reminded us that counterterrorism, of course, is a component of COIN. Again, sometimes we are ripe to disconnect these things. We start talking in terms of shift and pivot, forgetting the GWAT, forgetting counterterrorism and counter VEO as we shift or pivot to great power competition. Frankie made the point earlier. It's not a return to great power competition. It never went anywhere, right? We are now more aware and must return to it, but it's enduring. It always has the potentiality of being there. And now we may be looking at the great powers indirectly competing, indirectly to directly, but through proxy, and many of those proxies may be terrorist organizations, insurgent, violent extremist organizations, and the like, right? Vice Admiral, you made this comment right up front, and General Petraeus emphasized it a lot. Must consider and accept the fact that threats can and will reconstitute if and when not totally destroyed or defeated. And the reality that we have to reconsider the viability of some concepts as much as they are designed in terms of what defeat means and what it takes to destroy. and under what conditions. Great comparative assessment again on the Vietnam experience with that of Afghanistan. Real quickly, Vietnam, he had to offer completely divide the nation, completely absorb the Army and the United States military, and exacerbated at-home racial divides, right? So he brought us right back there, and I think those three things really captured the essence of the consequences of the Vietnam experience. Afghanistan, he said not so much, because Michael Hanlon's question was compare and contrast, and almost with an expectation that we would think because it's most proximate, and we're experiencing that Afghanistan would overshadow the Vietnam experience, not so much. But then I asked myself, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, what's the real lesson here in the comparison? What situational scenario is better? That the Afghanistan condition state is as traumatic as it is, we still have upwards of 70% of the American public. It speaks to that political will and that public awareness that was talked about yesterday. Does it speak worse for us in the wake of Afghanistan than it did even Vietnam, of a less than full body politic investment in the consequences of the last 20 years of Afghanistan, in what comes afterwards, epilogue as the new prologue? And maybe that's something we can talk a little bit about. He also compared the two withdrawals. He clearly said that Afghanistan was much worse because there was no peaceful measure. And as bad as Vietnam extraction was, there was at least a moment of relative peaceful pause where we could actually have a deliberative strategic plan. Still helter-skelter, but not as much as we are here. I'll end with this, and it was Michael Hanlon took advantage of asking General Petraeus his own question about 10 years ago. Tell us how this ends. You know, a net assessment of the past 20 years of the GWAT era. And he offered these things real quickly. His biggest takeaway in the positive sense was we've not had another 9/11 since. I think that's very serious. I think it comes off quippish. I think people put it off quippish, but I think it's a very serious thing that we need to consider. It's very difficult to proof a negative, but we got to figure out a way of proofing the negative, right? Maybe that's part of the grand strategy that we need as part of our leading way going forward, of taking full outcomes-based measures of effectiveness, of being able to do things that prevent. I add 4 additional things that were not put on the table during the session. Perhaps we inspired the growth of segments of within the Afghan society of a more cosmopolitan Afghan civil society, right? That might manifest in different ways. It's not the same Afghanistan under this Taliban rule as it was under the Taliban rule 20 years ago. We've inspired they've given birth literally to 1 to 2 generations of Afghans that are inspired. Perhaps that beacon on the hill may have some transference. We might see that in terms of their dialogue, in their self-determination, in determining who will govern, how they will govern, and how democratic, small d, that governance will be. Perhaps we raise great expectations and what might be the good, bad, and ugly consequences of that. Again, defeat an elusive, if not fantastical, concept in this day and age. And again, finally, tell me how this ends. As General Petraeus left us with in the session, he said, "I'm not sure it ever ends." And maybe therefore success is being okay with not losing. Right, and I'll pause there. I apologize for taking a little bit of time on that, but those were 2 major sessions that really put a lot on the table. I'll pause there and see if anybody has any comments or reactions to that.
Well, I'll jump in if there's no objections. I was struck by what you said a little bit earlier in this when we were talking about legitimacy, and it was reminded of that interview with Scott when, from his memory, the people that they were dealing with when they first got there were very easy to accept the idea that Americans were there to get some sort of retribution against Al-Qaeda. That made sense to them, and there was legitimacy there. And I think that's something that we might need to discuss when we're talking about, a leadership lens, is there needs to be a purpose for why we're doing something, and it needs to carry from multiple audiences. So it's not just leading against ourselves and saying this is why we're doing it, but also resonating with the people that we're trying to lead in a population that we're trying to influence. So maybe having, messaging, one of the real lessons we can learn from this is that this doesn't go so well. Population-centric anything doesn't go so well when the population isn't in the center. And if we're not messaging them deliberately and we're not recognizing that legitimacy needs to be tied to them, then it becomes easy to get enemy-centric. And when you're enemy-centric, you're not population-centric. And then the entire theory kind of goes away. So I think that's something worth remembering. And it ties back to the reality that strong states have strategic weaknesses. Andrew Mack talked about that in 1975. Ivan Argentoff has talked about that. And we can't ignore those. So to sit here and think that if we just build on the strengths of a strong state and ignore the weaknesses, we're just going to have like really, really underappreciated weaknesses. So I think we owe it to ourselves to recognize both the struggle that it takes to recognize our role in leadership of a population, and for us to spend time identifying the strategic weaknesses that the United States and any strong state is going to have when we're dealing with these kind of operations.
Oh, that's great. That's great, Joe.
Hey, Ike, I'm going to jump in real quick. I mean,
Please.
That was almost the master class that you provided in a short amount of time. So for students, just listen to that last 5-10 minutes. It's worth its weight in gold. So you did cover a lot of territory in a short amount of time. So who am I to sort of jump into some of that visionary thinking? But I'm going to take a little more of a realpolitik view on some of this, and it's not to suggest. I think, and we often confuse ways, means, and ends. And at the end of the day, we need to ensure that the homeland, that Afghanistan cannot be used as a base of operation to attack the homeland.
Yeah.
Everything else we can debate and discuss. And you know what? People much smarter than me will be able to convey a lot. But we also have very direct national interest priorities we need to be able to achieve. And the question I have is, can we do this remotely over the horizon? I want to think we can. I hope we can. I also hope COVID isn't real. I also hope a lot of things aren't real. They are, though. So the reality is how are we going to ensure that our direct national interest is being ensured and protected? And I don't know if we have a good enough answer. So another item we did not discuss here is that the threat itself is going to metastasize. Mm-hmm. And in part, it's shaped on our response. So we saw a big spike. Obviously, in the U.S., we have all sorts of ideological concerns from a violence standpoint. But even the Islamist threat, we saw a big spike in terms of homegrown threats in the United States. So it empowers others, and all I'm trying to convey, and I'm not doing it in a very eloquent or articulate kind of way. We got to hit our national interests. Everything else matters, but if we can't cover those discrete priorities, shame on us. And shame on us for all the women and men who have given so much to ensure we can keep our citizens safe going forward. So I don't want to take away from any of that. I don't even want to jump into the coin versus counterterrorism because there's so much there. The one other point, though, I would underscore, and again, maybe this is an unpopular position, it's the ideology too. I don't care if you defeat organizations, if the underpinning fuel and ideological underpinnings are still there, we're always going to see it pop up and metastasize in another way, shape, or form. So I'm sorry for that little bit of a rant, but that was an incredible masterclass you did there, Ike. No, but I don't want to lose the national interest. There are certain things that are more of a priority in my eyes than others that may be unpopular, but just from my perch.
Frank, thanks so much for that. I think that was incredibly eloquent, the way you put that. from a realpolitik, I would just add, I agree with everything you laid out. I would say, I guess what it raises the question in my mind, under an environment that, you know, we have a theory of next here at JSAL, we call it compound security and compound security threats. And this, I mean, just like compound interest, we love it because dollar cost average investment over time and you get exponential return. Think of the dark side of that in terms of a compound security threat, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're dealing with. We're ranging from the global pandemic of COVID-19 to metastasizing compound conflicts of Syria, Iraq, right? Afghanistan, Yemen, et cetera, et cetera. How pursuing in a realpolitik way one's national interests, how much of that is a Gordian knot? Right, to go back to our reminder by Mike McConnell of, you know, this started way back with Alexander. If he can get it right, then, you know, we should be a little bit more humble. But the Gordian knot of national interest as we traditionally defined it, maybe even more particularly in a Western sense, with human security. Ours and theirs, right? I'm reminded of Algeria, and, you know, it wasn't only a battle of Algeria that put the French on its heels, that brought down that particular republic. I think it was the third or fourth republic in France proper. There's less of a water's edge between the foreign and domestic, right? It becomes more and more every day fictive. How much of their self-determination in the over their places and based on their human security concerns, root causes, underlying currents, how much is that essential, no longer avoidable, no longer bypassable? Because in order to get to our interests, you have to go through the layers of what is essential to them and theirs. Right. That if any of that holds any explanatory water, that's a very complicated future in front of us. It's not linear, it's not sequential. Arguably, it can't even be separated as such. Yeah, but no, thanks for that, Frank. That's wonderful. I think I've got the next question. We've got probably about 10, 15 minutes left. Mike, I'm going to turn it to you. And let me go back to your thoughts on critical need for sharing intel and connecting the dots. Reflecting on the last 20 years, have we learned anything over the last 2 decades about information and intelligence sharing? Could more of that have prevented or at least mitigated the events on 9/11? What lessons have we learned then and since?
Thank you for the question, Ike. I'm going to play a little bit of a politician here. Rather than answer the question you asked me, I'm going to tell you what I want to say.
Perfect. That's perfect.
What I want to say is we're going to do this again next April. The focus of this conference was 9/11, the immediate aftermath, and so on. Now, because of what was going on in Afghanistan, it drug us a little bit more into lessons learned and so on. But the conference next April is designed to take a deep dive into all the legislative changes, policy changes, and so on. So we get in really deeper into it. The most insightful thing of the previous conversation for me is what David Petraeus said when considering the question, how does this end? It never ends. Right. So if we can just put that in our psyche, I think it's good for us. The way I interpret the question is, could we have prevented 9/11? The answer is yes. We could have, we should have. Now, first of all, I want to put things in perspective. There are 3 kinds of outcomes to any crisis. A policy success, it worked. An operational success, we accomplished our mission. Or intelligence failure. That's the only way. Anytime something goes wrong, well, intelligence failure. And as an intel professional, you learn that's part of the ethic, and you've got to deal with it as you move on. But we could have prevented 9/11 if we'd had better cooperation, information sharing, and so on. There was a CBS special recently that sort of revisited 9/11. I thought it was very insightful. And the case was being made by George Tenet, director of CIA, Michael Morrell, who was deputy director, the president's briefer, and then deputy director later, about what they knew and so on. But they didn't share critical information that was vital. And so the result was IRTPA, Intelligence Reform Terrorist Prevention Act, create a culture of collaboration. We have started down that path, but we're not there. I'll give you an example. The culture is need to know. And that means I have it, information sharing. Give me what you have, but you can't what I have. That's the culture of the organization. I think we need legislation that changes our information classification rules. If you think about breaking Nazi Germany code in World War II, pretty vital. We didn't let the Nazi Germany know that. If you think about our successes in the Cold War, pretty important. You weren't letting the Soviets know how we're being successful. We're in a new era. The threat today is largely cyber among terrorism, and it's to the critical infrastructure of the nation. Shouldn't the U.S. intelligence community be gathering information that is critical to the private sector and then flowing it to them in the fastest possible means? So I think rethinking our classification rules. The community will not change unless forced to change, and that generally requires legislation. Maybe one other example. What we started on my watch, and I don't know where it is today, so it's not fair to me to be critical, but here was the thinking. We're always going to have a need to protect sources and methods. We should create a cloud-based system for intelligence information. So if I'm a young analyst working on XYZ, and I'm not cleared for something, I'm at least allowed to know that there's something in the system that is pertinent to my research. That should empower me to go make my case to get access. We're always going to have some level of originator control. If we're dealing with a very sensitive human spy in a position that any compromise would result in the death of that person cooperating in the interest of the United States, we certainly need to protect it. But from the standpoint of protecting the country, the analytical community needs to be able to know there's information and they can process it and share it. And if there's something there that they don't have access to, they at least should be able to make the case for it. And that was what we were designing before I left. There were some iterations of it after that. I don't know if they still had that focus, but that was what I was certainly focused on. So could we have prevented 9/11? Yes. That was an intelligence failure. Are we better? Yes. Are we where we need to be? Not quite yet.
Can I jump on that? Because Admiral
absolutely.
McConnell touched on a number of points that I agree with 100%. I'm going to take maybe a little different perspective during 9/11. In the intelligence business are estimators, not clairvoyants. So knowing something's coming versus precisely when, where, and how is not always the same thing. That said, if you can break down the walls that the Admiral implicitly identified to enabling the sharing of intelligence and or information, you're going to get a lot closer. And some of those walls, real, perceived, and everything else, there were legal impediments to sharing some of that information pre 9/11. Should we have seen that coming? Yeah, a lot of people saw that coming. I just want to note, though, what we saw play out in Afghanistan 20 days ago, not 20 years ago, that is not an intelligence failure. I think most people could have told you how it would have played out. And I think that's a very different set of issues than 9/11 itself was. But I think the Admiral really brought up something important. We are going through the same darn thing right now with respect to cyber. And compounding the cyber set of issues is that it's not just the inside baseball alphabet soup of agencies that need to play ball together and fight as one team and take a unified approach, but it's really the private sector. And we have some of the very same structural impediments that we're going to be learning again after we get kicked, the proverbial ostrich with its head in the sand. And again, we all know that's there. That's different than knowing precisely who, what, where, when an advanced persistent threat may crystallize. But I just think that's such an important set of points. And, I'm the cyber guy, so I had to bring that up because we're there.
Terrific. Terrific and shocking all at the same time. No, I think you're exactly right. Frank, I know we're running a little late. I think you've got another date here.
2 minutes, unfortunately.
Maybe I'll let you riff over to Joe, and Joe, we can let you maybe round out. on the nation building piece. Like, I think you were going to.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, the great Secretary General Colin Powell, also known as the Pottery Barn question. If you break it, you fix it. Does that still hold any weight today? Should it hold weight today? And what are we thinking? And Joe, we'll start with you, and then turn it to anyone else. And Ike, if I bow out, please, I apologize, but I do have to do another one in a couple. So
no, and thanks very much.
We'll keep going. Yeah, we'll keep going.
It's just gonna be raised. The game is gonna be raised exponentially with me gone anyway.
No, we get to
So,
talk about Frank when he's gone.
exactly.
But I'll say I am interested in the idea of nation building, because it seems like it's tied to anytime we do something population centric, we get trapped in it. So it's like the nation building trap. And so when you have conversations with people about it, it seems like it's tied to our belief, and it might even be misguided, about the democratic peace idea, that if we can create a whole bunch of democracies don't fight, then we're not going to have as many people to fight. Then we can focus on the real bad actors out there. And I think that there's some folly in that, and that comes from, a lot of it is our arrogance in saying that the democracies worked out for us, especially coming out of World War II. Therefore, it would work out for everybody. But in order to do that, we have to really, really understand the causal factors that have led to our success. And if we don't do that, then the rest of it is just, talk. And I think because we don't spend a lot of time doing that, it's easy for us to get caught up in some sort of version of Wilsonianism, and the idea that when in doubt, we'll spread democracy, all for the same things. So what we have to think about, and sometimes I compare it to the idea of, say, the resource curse, right? The idea that in developing states that have more natural resources tend to have worse governments. And sometimes the conventional thinking is that happens because the states are incentivized to skip the need, or they overcome the need to develop governing institutions, and they can just use the money to buy that. So when the U.S. is involved in nation building, we might possibly be doing ourselves and that state that we're trying to help a disservice by providing a resource curse-like effect, meaning that we're taking away their incentives to build governing institutions. And so, if they rely on the U.S., it changes the incentives, and that's a bad thing. So I think to reframe going forward, we have to look back to the original lens that I was talking about earlier, back to my leadership lens. And so if we think about the role that the U.S. plays, and we talked a little bit about it earlier, of global leadership as opposed to dominance, then leadership involves, true leadership involves relational leadership, authentic leadership, and most importantly, servant leadership. And that might help us frame or reframe the effect that the U.S. will have when it's dealing with other states that we say we're trying to help. And so maybe one thing we can do is try to find ways to enhance a state's already existing national identity and cultural identity, as opposed to trying to do the mirror imaging one like we talked about earlier, and maybe think of ourselves as coaches and mentors rather than directive commander-like folks, so that we can maximize the identity that state already has to build institutions that fit that state. Because I think when we don't, we run into the trap of going back to one of my favorite things is Ian Bremmer's J-curve. And it's, and it reminds us that stability is also tied to regime choice. So we can talk about the regime choice, but if we don't understand the way that the United States impacts a person that we're trying, or a state that we're trying to help stability, and we're the cause of instability, then just as we think we're patting ourselves on the back, thinking we're doing a great job helping, and we're hurting. And that's not something that a leader should do. So can we do these kind of military operations, and can we move forward without nation building? I think we can. And I think we need to put some thought into how we do it, but I think we should definitely give it a shot. So I want to open it up to see if you had any comments about that before we find something else more interesting to talk about.
Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
No, I just wanted to say, Joe, I am not leaving because I was upset with your answer. I thought it was very well said. Thank you all, and I apologize for having to cut
No,
off a little short.
thanks so much, Frank. Thanks for everything.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
the 2 days.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Let me riff in on this a little bit. I love, Joe, your characterization of an American leadership, perhaps more in an indirect approach of a coach, player coach, right? Coaching, mentoring,
Sure.
but maybe a player coach, inevitably, right? It resonates a lot with building partner capacity, our IRA kind of individual retirement account approach to investing in
Right.
allies and partners, right? Where, over the last 150 years, the United States has been in the business of this, traditional Roth IRA style approach to investing in allies and partners. And what do we know about IRAs and IRA investments? Again, it's that dollar cost average, exponential dividends. If you have the patience, right? If you have the strategic patience to let the small dollar cost average investments work their way in the market in an organic and natural way, what do you also know on the negative side? Heavy penalties, tax penalties for early withdrawals. Right? We can take that in a figurative sense, of course, metaphorically, but maybe in the case of Afghanistan, it takes on a more literal sense as well. A couple of thoughts on the nation building. I think we have to reconsider at this point our conflations and things we conflate. There's a big difference between nation building and state building versus state building. Joe, you got to it in your address. My lessons gathered, perhaps for learning but not yet learned, regardless of the blueness or the redness of the policy over the last 20 years, frankly, over the last 30, 40 years, it's clear that a harmony across all political parts and political lines is that the United States does not like nor does it want to do what it calls nation building. But at the same time, we want all nations to be and behave as such, right? So there's a lot we want for them, and for them genuinely so, because we enjoy and have reaped the benefits and the bounty of the returns of nation statehood. But when it comes to doing the investments, we're good at making the initial investments, but maybe an unfortunate history of too little, too late for not long enough. And again, the early withdrawal piece. I think what we mean when we say nation building, maybe we really mean state building. There's a big difference. If you ask me the future of nation building, I think it's very difficult to build nations, especially directly. You're going to commit generation. In order for me to embrace nation building, I got to go back to Admiral McConnell's comments in the Reagan admonition of, be the shining city on the hill and lead by example, right? Put ideas out, be a promoter of ideas and ideals, lead by example, and then hopefully that inspires in a civil society kind of way, emergence from the ground level up of self-determination towards small d democratic-like futures. Is there stuff that we can do in terms of supporting others' state building? I not only say yes, but I say under compound security conditions that I believe defines the character of global geopolitical competition today and forward. I think it's essential. Right. I think it's essential. And so that's an investment we're going to have to come to terms with if we want the outcomes and results to be sustainable and legitimate in a way that do not threaten, as Frank put it, traditional sense, realpolitik sense of national vital interests of security, and particularly security of our homeland. I think some kind of committed partnering support to others' state building is probably required. Right. Conditions would be at invitation, and I would include as an invitation, I'd go back to the George W. Bush years of, if you prove yourself to be a safe harbor or sanctuary to those kinds of threats that have malintent and global reach, directed particularly to the United States homelands and the homelands of our partners and allies. Right, mm-hmm. I would put that as part of the invitation. In support of their self-determinations, though, in support of their self-determinations. I think that calls for an indirect approach, and also I think it calls for a limited approach when we're thinking about from grand strategy to grand tactics. And again, I would end, or I'd pause with, lead and intervene with our ideas. I think we're at an Aurelius moment, a Marcus Aurelius moment. If you think back to the parallels to the Pax Romana, and where they reached almost a zenith in terms of the power of Rome as an idea, the universalism of Rome as an idea, and its ability to bring force in powerful, legitimate ways to reinforce. But that was zenith point. And after that began the decline and the fall. We have lots of hindsight to look back, being better than 2020. And, all the Roman scholars would tell us, failures from within, enemies from without. Mm-hmm. But one of the main tenets of the failure, the decline and fall, was the loss of a republic on behalf of having to become more and more imperial and holding what you got through force and not power. Right. And one of the critical things was a walking away from allies and partners and the client states, as they were called at the time, to be representatives and actually hold your frontier in a legitimate way in the context of who they were at the time. Variations of the Roman theme. That seems to be where the United States has been maybe over the last 30, 40 years. We may be pressing force as a poor proxy for power. The power of our ideas as they are interpreted and tailored to the self-determinations of nations, nation statehoods, and different kinds of statehoods worldwide. I'll pause there and see if there are any reactions to that.
Ike, what I would like to do is close us out with a story that's going to anger my old community.
That's great.
And leave a question. Leave a question. Here's my story.
Perfect.
My observation over 56 years of doing this is the U.S. intelligence community is incredibly conservative. It is risk averse. I made a point earlier about organizations that are built for resiliency and continuity and not necessarily innovation. So in my career, what I observed is the community had evidence, but failed to call the Soviet invasion into Hungary, the Soviet invasion into Czechoslovakia, the Soviet invasion into Afghanistan, the Yom Kippur War, and even on my watch as DNI, the Russian invasion of Georgia. We had the evidence, but we just couldn't bring it to ourselves, on ourselves to make the call. So I found myself in a privileged position of being a brand new young Navy captain, just selected for flag, and I'm working for a general that you may recall named Colin Powell. And so I reported on my birthday, 26th of July, and the Iraqis invaded on the 2nd of August, 1990. So now I'm the new guy, and we're scrambling to get our act together. And so I asked the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, give me your best two animals. And they were a little squabbling back and forth, but I got them because I had the chairman sort of looking over my shoulder. So we were down to the nub. The Iraqis had moved force into the field. They were right on the Kuwaiti border. So I set the experts down, Air Force, Navy, Marine, Army. And I said, what more do they need? Don't need anything else. They got everything. They got the beans and the bullets and the comms. They're ready to go. I said, well, are they going to come across the line? And they said, well, we don't have any direct evidence. And I said, well, do you think they're coming across the line? Well, we kind of think so. I said, well, let's make the call. Let's go to watch condition 1. Oh, well, no, we've never done that before. I said, okay, stand by. I'm going to see the chairman. So I went upstairs and I went into the EA's office and I said, hey, Dick Chilcote. I said, hey, Dick, I need to see the chairman. He said, yeah, he's right. I get you. No, I didn't say I need to talk to him. I said, I need to see him. He said, what? I said, I just want to see him. He said, well, look in the peephole. So I looked in there. I said, yep, there's the chairman. I said, you saw me see the chairman, right? And he said, yeah. I said, then I went down to the snack bar and got a Coke. Then I went back down to the assembled group and I said, men and women, I've seen the chairman and here's what we're going to do. We called watch condition 1, they're coming, but we only beat it by 24 hours. So I'm just making an observation for those youngsters in the community. Put your conservative concerns away. Make the call when you need to make the call. It's in the interest of the nation. Now, here's my question for teeing up maybe our conference next April.
Excellent.
George W. Bush adopted something that really surprised me. It was called a preemption strategy. Strike them before they strike us. Is that still viable? Is that our strategy? Should it be our strategy? That's the question that I would like to ask in preparation going into our next April conference on this subject. We are where we are.
Yeah.
We were attacked. It was an intelligence failure. It could have been prevented. We've done some things to mitigate. We're now have withdrawn from Afghanistan. There's some aftermath. Al-Qaeda and ISIS will reconstitute. Is the strategy that the United States should consider a preemption strategy? I leave that question open. Thank you very much for opportunity to participate in this panel. You all have my greatest respect. Thank you so much.
And Mike, Vice Admiral McConnell, thank you for your service, past, present, and future. Dr. Long, phenomenal engagement yesterday and today, and just a pleasure to work with you here at the Joint Special Operations University. Again, our thanks to Frank Cilluffo for his contributions yesterday and today, and it continues. And thanks again. I think we met our mark and then some. Mr. McConnell, perfect tee up epilogue is prologue for the April conference. And with that said, Ron, back over to you, sir.
As we close, I'd be remiss if I didn't provide a lot of thank yous. First, to our speakers and our panelists and our moderators and our interviewers, and especially their executive assistants and their schedulers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This conference would not have been possible without you, and all of you donated your time, lots of time, and especially your intellect. You've given us a lot of food for thought, so I can't thank you enough for your contribution, not just to our country, but to this conference. So again, thank you. I'd like to thank a lot of other people as well. We're going to put their names up on the screen, from Kate Whitaker of our Cyber Florida staff, DCE Studios. Lots of other folks had a hand in organizing the event. They're behind the scenes, and we're going to put them right up front. Let me also give a special thanks to Adib Farhadi. Adib is actually the project officer for these conferences, but he's also an Afghani, and he has spent the last couple of weeks ensconced in U.S. Central Command helping to vet Afghan evacuees. So Adib, I know you couldn't be with us today, but thank you for your service and for what you've been doing for the evacuation. A couple of things in closing. Number one, we've recorded the whole thing. I warned you about that at the beginning. This is classified and open source. It'll be posted on various websites, so look for that. Secondly, it's going to be followed by a book of proceedings, so look for that as well. We know that we weren't able to interact with the speakers on a live basis, even with our live panel. But if you still have questions, we would encourage you to submit them. We're going to post an email address on the websites, particularly the conference website. So you'll be able to do that, submit questions, and we'll do our very, very best to respond to all of them. One last thank you. On behalf of our co-sponsors, U.S. Central Command, National Defense University's Near East and South Asia Center, the University of South Florida and its College of Arts and Sciences, and of course, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, my organization, and me personally, thank you all for your time and your attention. I hope you learned as much as we did. I know we learned a lot just putting the conference together, and we certainly learned a lot over the last 2 days, and I hope you have as well. So I thank you, and I remind you that the second installment of this conference is going to occur next April. Look for that, look for the announcement. We promise an equally compelling, eye-watering list of speakers as we explore the longer-term, more strategic implications of 9/11. But until then, thank you all very much, and good evening.